The Mind's Eye podcast with VJ Turnoff is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, Amazon, all major platforms. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. You're now standing at the intersection of history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, host of this auditorium of audacity. On this edition, we got the spiritual sister to, last week's show when we talked about the afterlife and we presented evidence through the prism of near-death experiences and a couple other disciplines. If you've been tuning into the Mind's Eye for a while, then you probably know that death is something that I've been grappling with for a while, and I guess I have this death anxiety. It's kind of like this consistent, dull, existential dread sometimes from, kind of stemming from whether consciousness can exist outside the body when we die. For this show, we're going to take that conversation to its next logical step, or I guess in a complementary fashion, whatever way you want to look at it. We're going to address the question, does modern science prove or disprove God? Some scientists think that the Big Bang, DNA, Goldilocks zone undermines any possibility of intelligent design behind our cosmos, our biology. Our guest on this episode, New York Times bestselling author Dr. Stephen Meyer, believes that these three scientific discoveries actually provide existence for the contrary, the existence of an intelligent designer. As per usual, I'm going to play the role of devil's advocate, try and poke some holes in the argument of tonight's guest, and we look at all topics from science to mysteries, and so whatever we do, it's always with respect. That's number one on this program. Our discussion is going to be based on Dr. Meyer's latest book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. Something new I've been doing over the past few episodes, if you're on social media with us, as I prepare for the show, I take you on that journey, and so I've been posting excerpts from the book all week leading up to it on Facebook and Twitter. You can get the links there now if you want that sneak peek. It's on themindseyemedia.com. That's where you'll find links to the social media, lots of fun and informative stuff up there as well. Probably the only place where you can find blogs on Hamilton, Captain America, and Martin Luther King. I'm also posting news articles that I read throughout the week that I think are pretty interesting, like the recent melding of a half monkey, half human chimera. That's pretty fraught with some ethical questions there. Or how neuroscientists recently discovered zombie genes, as they're called, that come to life as the human brain is actually dying. Most importantly, most likely for you, are the links to all the free archives, over 120 episodes, ready to download and listen to it anytime you want. If you like what you hear, you read, and all the stuff that we put up on themindseyemedia.com, you appreciate the hard work and you want to show your support and love for the show, please hit that donate button at the top of the website. I really can't tell you and stress how much your support really does mean to me. Not to mention helping cover the cost of production and all the jazz of expanding the Mind's Eye library. Everyone who supports, no matter how big or small, you're going to get a free, never heard before, unaired show. The more you give, the more you get in return. I got free books I'm ready to give out. And whether you support monetarily or not, I really do appreciate you listening either way. Now that that's out of the way, let's welcome Dr. Stephen Meyer. You've seen and read him on all the major networks, all the major news outlets. Now, for the first time, he steps into the mind's eye to shine a light on the possible origins of the universe and whether there was a guiding hand. Doctor, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on the mind's eye. What an intriguing title for a podcast.
Well, I think it definitely applies to what we're going to be talking about, and I'm excited to talk to you about after reading your book. And there was a lot. My head's still spinning from that, by the way, in a good way, FYI. And let's just get into the book. It's called Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. Doctor, tell me what those 3 discoveries are that you're talking about.
Well, the first is that, as best we can tell, the universe, the material universe of matter, space, time, and energy, had a definite beginning a finite time ago. In fact, time and space themselves are thought to have come into existence a finite time ago, if you can get your head around that. The second is that from the beginning of the universe, the basic physical parameters of the universe have been very finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life, and that fine tuning is incredibly improbable. Against all odds, we find that these parameters, the exact strength of gravitational force, the exact strength of electromagnetic force, the masses of the elementary particles, the rate at which the universe is expanding, and the force that's producing that expansion are all beautifully finely tuned. So we live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where things are not too strong, not too weak, not too fast, not too slow, not too heavy, not too light, just right to allow for life. And many physicists have seen in that evidence an indicator of a prior fine-tuner, that this looks to them to be evidence of design. Of course, there's an alternative hypothesis we can discuss, but that's been the common sense interpretation, as one physicist put it. And the third big discovery is that at the foundation of life, in the large molecules that are necessary to sustain life, DNA, RNA, and proteins, we have information stored in a digital form. Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953, but in 1957, Crick advanced something called the sequence hypothesis, where he proposed that the subunits, the chemical subunits along the interior of the twisting double helix molecule known as DNA, that these subunits are functioning like alphabetic characters in that their precise sequential arrangement is providing instructions for building crucial parts of the cell. And this hypothesis was later confirmed. So at the foundation of life, we've discovered something very much like a computer program, suggesting a master programmer for life. So the universe had a beginning. It's been finely tuned since the beginning. And we've had big bursts of biological form and therefore new amounts of biological information in our Earth's biosphere over time. Those three discoveries, I argue, point not only to a designing intelligence, but to one which must be both active in the creation and also transcend the creation.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. So let's take each discovery individually. The Big Bang Theory, the beginning of the universe. I mean, how does that? I mean, it's taken as a scientific tenet now for the most part. I mean, how does that cosmological discovery support that? I guess the God hypothesis, as you call it.
Well, it's first of all, it's a fascinating story of discovery itself. That for a very long time, it was sort of the default position among physicists and many philosophers that the universe was eternal and self-existent, that it did not need an external creator of any kind because it had always been here. And you may remember the Cosmos series, not the more recent one by Neil deGrasse Tyson, but rather the original one by Carl Sagan, where he recited the kind of materialist mantra that the universe is all there is and all there was and all there ever will be. The discovery of the Big Bang occurred first in the 1920s when the observational astronomers realized that the light coming from very distant galaxies was being stretched such that the wavelengths were longer than you would expect if the objects, the galaxies, were stationary. As an object moves away, the wavelength of light or wavelength of sound will be stretched out. And in the case of light, in the visible spectrum, red light is the light that corresponds to the longer wavelengths. Violet has shorter wavelengths. So astronomers call this the evidence of redshift. And as astronomers, first Edwin Hubble and his colleague Humason, and then later his graduate assistant Alan Sandage, whom I met when I was a young scientist, investigated the night sky, they realized that in all quadrants of the night sky, this redshift evidence was they could confirm that the galaxies were expanding because of this redshift evidence. And so that painted the picture of a universe that was expanding in a roughly spherically symmetric way, kind of like a balloon being blown up. That's in the forward direction of time. But if you reverse that in in the reverse direction of time, at each progressive point in the past, the universe would have been smaller and smaller and smaller, and the galactic material would have been closer and closer and closer together until it was finally converged on a point. And that point marked the beginning of the expansion of the universe and arguably the beginning of the universe itself. Now, there were other developments in theoretical physics based largely on Einstein's theory of general relativity, his new theory of gravity that he advanced in 1915, that allowed physicists to establish that there had been what they call a singularity at the beginning, where the curvature of space, according to Einstein's theory, matter curves space. Well, if matter is getting more and more densely compacted in the reverse direction of time, space would be getting more and more tightly curved until eventually you'd reach a point, a limiting case, where the curvature would reach an infinite corresponding to zero spatial volume, matching the beginning of the universe, before which the laws of physics would have broken down. We couldn't make an explanation by reference to the laws of physics because there would be no physics at that point. And you similarly could not explain the origin of the universe by reference to a strictly material cause, because it was matter and energy, as well as space and time, that began to exist at that beginning point. So the possibility of a materialistic explanation breaks down, and instead you get a picture of the origin of the universe, which is very similar to what the medieval theologians thought of when they used the phrase creatio ex nihilo, that the physical universe comes out of literally nothing physical, and instead requires a causal agent which transcends matter, space, time, and energy, and also has the ability to cause a very decided change of state, suggesting a kind of willful act and therefore an intelligent one. So the discovery of the beginning not only confirmed the scriptural idea of in the beginning, that there was a beginning, but it also revived an ancient argument called the cosmological argument for the existence of God, which was predicated on the idea that there was a beginning. The argument went like this: whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have had a cause, and since all causes are separate from the effects they produce, that it must have been a transcendent cause. And the medieval philosophers would conclude by saying, we call this cause God. And that's what I call the return of the God hypothesis, because now that idea has come back as a result of modern cosmological discoveries.
Big Bang Theory seems to be kind of taken as a scientific tenet. You believe that it is supporting evidence for the existence of God, possibly intelligent design at least. Other scientists don't. I mean, how can there be such extreme interpretations on the same scientific theory?
Well, there are other cosmological models that have been proposed in part to circumvent this problem of the singularity at the beginning, and we know this because one of the chief architects of the main alternative cosmological model was Stephen Hawking himself. And that's interesting because Hawking was the first physicist to prove in a mathematical way the singularity theorem. Hawking then found that conclusion scientifically unsatisfactory because it implied that, as the physicist Paul Davies put it, there was an extremity beyond which physical reasoning was impossible. And so Hawking proposed another cosmological model called quantum cosmology. He popularized that in a book called The Brief History of Time. But in the book, I show that if you can opt for that approach if you like, and that invokes the idea that when the universe is very small, the physics of the quantum world would apply and would be relevant to describing the universe. But the quantum cosmological model actually doesn't eliminate the singularity; it presupposes it. But moreover, it attempts to explain the origin of the universe as the result of a mathematical concept, basically as a result of pure mathematics. The physical laws describing some kind of quantum theory of gravity before there would have been matter, space, time, and energy. And many of the proponents of this idea have said, well, gee, that raises an interesting question, because as Alexander Vilenkin, a quantum cosmology proponent, has said, what tablet could these laws of physics have been written on before there was matter, space, time, or energy? The laws of physics, in our experience, describe pre-existing matter and energy and how they interact with each other within space and time. If there's no matter, space, time, or energy, and it's just pure math, that's a very strange kind of explanation. How do you get matter out of math, especially when math is conceptual and always exists in a mind? And Volinkin tumbled to this in a kind of rhetorical question he asked at the end of one of his books. He said, are we therefore saying that the universe, that a mind predated the universe? And Hawking himself was uncomfortable with this. He said, what puts fire in the equations that gives them a universe to describe? So a universe of pure, the idea that the universe can come out of nothing but pure math is certainly not materialistic. It suggests an idealist or arguably theistic interpretation of the origin of the universe, every bit as much as the idea of a pure singularity does. So there's a way around the singularity, but it comes with its own unintended theological implications.
You brought up Einstein a couple times, and didn't he support the theory of laws of thermodynamics, that energy can't be created or destroyed, only change into a different form? I mean, wouldn't that argue against the God hypothesis?
Well, actually, it's quite supportive. I mean, most physicists, I think almost all physicists accept the entropy laws. One of the cosmological models that was proposed to as an alternative to the Big Bang was the idea of an oscillating universe. And there's even been some attempts to revive that recently under the heading of a cyclical universe. But it was the idea that the universe would, yes, indeed, is expanding now, but eventually it will recollapse. And once it recollapses, it will rebound and expand again and then recollapse, and you'll have an infinite cycle. But the physicist Alan Guth from MIT showed in the 1980s that the problem with, there was a thermodynamic related problem with that, and that is that with each successive cycle, the energy available to do work would diminish. So even if we are in a cyclical universe, an oscillating universe, it must have had a beginning. And this is a conclusion derived from thermodynamic considerations, as well as some in observational astronomy. So the entropy considerations have tended to favor the idea that there must have been a beginning.
Let's go a little bit more into the second part of, or the second discovery, the Goldilocks zone. You called it cosmic fine-tuning, and that's really the habitable zone where everything just, has to be just right for life to exist on a planet. And I guess similar to the Big Bang Theory, if you apply a religious prism, it's going to be pretty divisive. I mean, how does the Goldilocks zone, or cosmic fine-tuning, as you say, support intelligent design?
Well, there's two different notions. One is the conditions that make our local planetary system fit for life, in particular our planet. And then there's the cosmic fine-tuning, as you mentioned, that have to do with parameters that are very fundamental, that were set either at the Big Bang or soon after, and that make even basic chemistry and stable galaxies possible, let alone life. And the exquisite precision of these parameters and the number of independent such parameters that exist mean that the conditions that are required for a life-conducive universe are extremely improbable. And yet there doesn't seem to be any underlying physical principle or logical principle as to why these values have been set precisely as they are. And so many physicists and philosophers of science have seen in this clear evidence of design. We tend to detect design when we have an ensemble of improbable parameters that function together to perform an overall objective or discernible end. And we have that kind of convergence when we're talking about cosmic fine-tuning. Other systems that we would describe as finely tuned are things like French recipes, internal combustion engines, sections of digital software code. And so fine-tuning as a phenomenon can be tightly defined theoretically, and the parameters that jointly constitute fine-tuning, an ensemble of improbable parameters plus that exemplify a functional set of functional requirements. Those two things together, improbable combination plus an exemplification of functional requirements, in our experience, uniformly point to an intelligent agent, so that the intuition that the fine-tuning points to a fine-tuner is well grounded theoretically. The attempt to explain that away has primarily centered around a proposal known as the multiverse, which we could also discuss. And so most physicists accept that the universe is finely tuned. The question is, how do we explain it? Is it the result of one God or many universes?
Honestly, to me, the multiverse can be a little bit of a distraction from this discussion. Personally, I mean, it's definitely built-in part of it, but for me, I kind of want to focus on some other parts. If there is this cosmic fine-tuning, why isn't there more life out there?
That could be a function of divine extravagance. That the universe was exquisitely designed at a fundamental level to be. For the purpose of life in just one place, although we don't know that there isn't life in other places. So far, no indications of same. But I think that the key is that we do have the fine tuning. It requires explanation, and the kind of explanation that suffices in every other realm of experience for fine tuning as a phenomenon is always intelligence. I'd also come back a little bit about the idea that the multiverse is a distraction. Because
all right, yeah, I'll let you say your piece on it. I didn't mean to cut you off that way.
No, it's fine. It's everyone has. I mean, and I go through this in the book. There's the weak anthropic principle, the strong anthropic principle, the various attempts to account for the fine tuning apart from design. But I would say the most popular one today is, in fact, the multiverse. And the problem with the multiverse that I expose in the book is that that multiverse hypothesis, as a condition of its plausibility, must have a universe-generating mechanism. If there are just a multiplicity of universes out there and they're all causally disconnected from our own, then those universes don't affect anything in our universe, including the probabilities associated with whatever it is that is responsible for producing the fine-tuning. So to make the multiverse hypothesis work, there must be a universe-generating mechanism of some kind that allows the multiverse proponent to portray our universe as a kind of lucky winner in a great cosmic lottery. And that's where the rub comes in, because the two main universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed, one based on string theory, another based on inflationary cosmology, both require exquisite prior and unexplained fine-tuning, just taking us back to where we started. And since the multiverse hypothesis doesn't actually explain the ultimate source of fine-tuning, the remaining more plausible explanation of intelligent design stands, I argue.
Yeah, you're going to hear me kind of go back and forth between everything, but kind of where my stance is that modern science and science in general, it can explain the extrinsic value of this. It can measure, it can tell me, but it necessarily can't really tell me the intrinsic, the why of it all. And I guess for me, that's one of the bigger questions tonight. I mean, what about Darwinism? I mean, do you believe that it's an element of? No, please.
Oh, yeah. No, I just, on this why-how distinction that is often made, I mean, it's kind of almost a cliche among scientists to say that science tells us how, it doesn't tell us why. Why questions are often causal questions, and science is very concerned about causes. So there are certain kinds of why questions that science does address, and I think questions of causal origin are the kinds of questions that science addresses that are why questions. I think what you were alluding to, though, is questions of larger meaning, and what was the purpose of something being made. We can detect the action of an intelligence from in the echo of its effects. We often use the example of, say, Mount Rushmore or a section of written text or something. But if you can't decode the text, and if you couldn't talk to the artist, you may not know why he carved the images on the mountain. So I mean, there are definitely questions that science doesn't address, but I just push back a little bit at the idea that science never addresses causal why questions, because it absolutely does that. A lot of modern medicine is attempting to assign causation, which are questions of causation are questions about why. So that's just an old saw that a lot of scientists say over and over and over again, and it pushes one of my buttons, but it's okay.
Yeah, I get that. It is a fairly reductive statement, no doubt about that. And I guess really more.
It wasn't what you meant, I know.
Yeah, I guess more and more. I guess I appreciate I guess both. There's the extrinsic versus intrinsic push and pull, and I appreciate that part of the conversation. I think that there's obviously room for both. And I think both approaches are completely fine.
Sure.
How about, Darwinism? Where does that fall into that? Is that just another element of intelligent design for you?
Well,
or not even part of the conversation?
Yeah, Darwinism is a very important part of the conversation because it was part of the overarching materialistic narrative or story that developed in the late 19th century. That if we start from the origin of the solar system, the origin of the major geologic features, the origin of new forms of life as proposed by Darwin, and then his theory was extended in both directions of time. There were some evolutionary thinkers like Haeckel and Huxley, and then later Oparin, who attempted to use Darwinian-style reasoning to explain the origin of the first life, and Darwin himself extended his origin of species concept to explain the origin of human life, all by undirected, purely materialistic processes. And so by the end of the 19th century, there was a kind of seamless materialistic story or narrative that purported to be able to explain the origin of everything from our solar system right up to human beings without invoking any designing intelligence or purposive agent of any kind. And so Darwinian evolution has obviously a lot going for it as an explanation for variation and adaptation, but increasingly leading people in evolutionary biology, in the subdiscipline of biology, the technical field itself, are questioning its adequacy as an explanation for major innovations in the history of life. It does a great job of explaining how finch beaks get a little bigger or smaller, how antibiotic resistance is confirmed on bacteria. The classic examples in the textbooks involve minor modifications of existing forms. It doesn't do nearly as good a job of explaining where birds and mammals and animals come from in the first place. It does a good job of explaining minor modification, not major variation. And I wrote quite a lot about this in my second book, Darwin's Doubt, which was about one of the greatest events of innovation in the history of life, the Cambrian explosion. This was the fossil evidence of that event bothered Darwin in the 19th century because it was so abrupt and so discontinuous. I argue in Darwin's Doubt that there's a second problem in addition to the fossil discontinuity, which, by the way, has only become more acute since his time. But that second problem is essentially the engineering problem of how do you build these complex animal forms when we now know that that information is critical to constructing not only the molecules that provide the basis of cellular life, but the higher order structures, the organs, the tissues, the body plans that arise in these major animal, these bursts of animal form. So I think Darwinism, modern neo-Darwinism, I think is increasingly questioned by people in the field. I attended a conference at the Royal Society in 2016 that was called by a group of evolutionary biologists looking for new theories and new mechanisms of evolution, precisely because they recognize that the mutation selection mechanism has a very limited creative power. It can modify but not innovate.
Yeah, I read multiple times that, Darwin wasn't even a Darwinist by the end of his life, and you just kind of told about that. And you just touched on the third discovery of DNA, and part of that in your theory, you talk about how it contains a digital code. And DNA is, the molecules essential for all life forms to exist. So expand upon, the digital code idea.
Yeah, right. Well, Watson and Crick famously elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953 of their fantastic 900-word paper in Nature, extraordinary, packed a punch into just a few words. In 1957, Crick formulates an expansion on that thinking and proposes what's known as the sequence hypothesis. And that's the idea that the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or like digital characters, like the zeros and ones in a section of software. That hypothesis takes a while to confirm, But eventually, by about 1965, molecular biologists have elucidated the whole gene expression system, and they know that the digital code in the DNA is directing the construction of the proteins and protein machines that are absolutely necessary to cellular life. So you have something that is elucidated that is akin to our modern CAD/CAM systems, whereby we use information in manufacturing to direct the construction of mechanical parts and systems. So what they end up discovering is that at the foundation, even the simplest living cell, you've got digital code in the information-bearing molecules of DNA and RNA, but these molecules are part of a whole information storage, transmission, and processing system that mirrors our own digital world, but is much more complex and therefore suggests design. Richard Dawkins says the DNA functions like a machine code. Leroy Hood says it contains digital code. Bill Gates says it's operating like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. All three of these observations are highly suggestive because we know that information and information processing systems always come from intelligent agents. And in fact, not only when we find information in a kind of programming context, but whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information transmitted over a radio signal, information is always the product of intelligence. And I've argued in Signature in the Cell and then again in Darwin's Doubt in a different context that the information necessary to produce the first life and the major bursts of innovation in the history of life points to the activity of a prior designing intelligence based on our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to generate the kind of information we find in living systems, functional digital information.
If these three discoveries, if they do really, I mean, they suggest that intelligence design to the universe, then what do the discoveries also tell us about who is the intelligent designer, and what kind of designing mind are we talking about?
Right. I mean, that is the presenting question of this new book. So to address that, I broadened the search window, if you will, to examine other evidence from physics and cosmology. One of the hypotheses about the nature of the designing intelligence that has been formulated by very prominent scientists, Francis Crick himself floated this, as has Richard Dawkins. One of the hypotheses is that the designing intelligence is an immanent intelligence, an intelligence within the cosmos, some sort of being that itself evolved by undirected natural processes and then reached a point of intelligence and seeded life here on Earth. Crick proposed this because he recognized the conditions on the early Earth were so hostile to any chemical evolution. There's an obvious problem with that, and that is that it doesn't solve the problem of the origin of information, which is necessary to get any process of evolution going. And so it just pushes that fundamental problem off into space someplace and leaves it unanswered. But the even more fundamental problem is that no being within the cosmos can account for the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe that make its existence possible, or make the evolution of life and its subsequent existence possible. In other words, the evidence of design that we have in the fine-tuning precedes any possible origin of an immanent intelligence. So even if there is such an agent within the cosmos, its existence would not explain the fine-tuning of the universe itself. That kind of evidence seems to point to a more transcendent intelligence that is involved in setting up the universe as a whole. And of course, no immanent intelligence could explain the origin of the universe either. So I think that hypothesis is causally inadequate. The other hypothesis that one could consider would be a deistic God that acts at the beginning of the universe, but only at the beginning. I think that hypothesis could explain both the fine-tuning and the origin of the universe, but not the evidence we have of design that arises long after the beginning in the Earth's biosphere at the point of the origin of life or the origin of new forms of life, such as the Cambrian explosion we were talking about a few minutes ago. And so what I do in the book is I look at a number of metaphysical hypotheses: deism, pantheism, strict materialism, and classical theism, and evaluate each of them according to their explanatory power and their term of art in this way of reasoning, and science called causal adequacy, the causal adequacy of these different hypotheses. So essentially a kind of what's the game where they push everybody off the island, but at the end of the day, I argue that only theism can explain the ensemble of the key evidences we have about biological and cosmological origins. It provides the best overall explanation, and on that basis I elect it, and that's what I call the return of the God hypothesis.
Let's say I agree that there is a God, right? Then one of the next questions become, well, what was before God? Then if there is a God, who created that God? I mean, it's kind of, for me, it can be a turtles all the way down type thing. I mean, how do you respond to someone grappling with God from that perspective?
That's a great question, and it's obviously a common objection to the idea of intelligent design. Richard Dawkins has raised it as the "who designed the designer" objection. Mm-hmm. My response to that is that in every system of thought, every worldview or metaphysical system of thought, something functions as a primitive or as the prime reality, the thing from which everything else came. With the new cosmology implies that matter, energy, space, and time, what we call the material universe or the physical universe, is a poor candidate to be that thing, that entity from which everything else came, because it arises a finite time ago. It begins to exist, and to explain its causal origin, you must invoke something else as a more primitive or more fundamental entity. So classical theism, with the idea that God is the eternal self-existent thing rather than matter being the eternal self-existent thing, provides a better explanation for the origin of matter, the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of life than does a materialistic system. Every system is subject to that, well, then what came before that objection? But every system of thought must elect to start with something. And I think a transcendent intelligence that is also willing and able to act within time provides the best overall explanation of these key pieces of evidence that we have, and thus I think functions as the best candidate prime reality or primitive, as philosophers sometimes speak of it.
Your biggest criticism, I guess the biggest criticism of the God hypothesis is that you're just filling in our current gaps of scientific knowledge with evidence for proof of God. I mean, how do you respond to criticism like that, Stephen?
Yeah, that's again a very good and on point question and objection. I spend an entire chapter on this near the end of the book, chapter 20. It's called Acts of God or God of the Gaps, and I start by explaining why intelligent design is not a God of the Gaps argument. The hypothesis of intelligent design is rendered more plausible by the failure of materialistic theories of, say, the origin of life to account for the origin of information necessary to produce life. And by the way, that's nearly universally acknowledged, even among people working in origin of life studies, that we do not have an adequate chemical evolutionary explanation for the origin of the first life. And one of the big reasons that the explanations are insufficient is that we don't have an explanation for the origin of information that's plausible or consistent with what chemistry does. So it is true that part of the basis for the inference to design is the inadequacy of competing hypotheses. But I'm using a method of reasoning that's commonly used in the historical sciences, known as inference to the best explanation, or the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And part of what makes an explanation best is that we have independent experience of a particular kind of cause producing a particular kind of effect, the effect in question. In this case, the origin of information. So we're not only arguing from the failure of materialistic explanations to account for the origin of functional digital information, we're arguing because of the positive knowledge we have that intelligent agents alone produce that effect of interest. So it's not an argument from ignorance, which would make it a God of the Gaps argument. It is an inference to the best explanation based on our knowledge of cause and effect. So it's an argument based on knowledge, not ignorance. Arguments from ignorance have the form, cause A is insufficient to produce effect X, therefore cause B must have done it, without providing any positive evidence that cause B is capable of producing the effect in question. In the book, in all of the work I've done on intelligent design, I provide independent evidence that the alternative cause of intelligent design is causally adequate to produce the effect in question. And then I make similar arguments when we're talking about cosmology as to why God as an explanatory concept would have within it the attributes inherent within the concept are attributes that would give it causal adequacy with respect to the particular features at hand. So this is a more theoretical argument, but this is the type of argument that's also perfectly acceptable within physics. So it's not an argument from ignorance, but rather an argument from knowledge or from a positive epistemological basis where we're providing good reasons to think that a particular kind of entity would have particular type of causal powers capable of producing the effects in question. And I go into this in quite a lot of detail, and I'd encourage interested readers to read that, because this old saw of God of the gaps, I think, is an inadequate objection, and it's facile and easily trotted out, but there's really a very rigorous form of reasoning that underlies the positive inference, first to intelligent design, and then secondly to a designer with the attributes that, for example, Jews and Christians and other classical theists have always ascribed to God.
I think approaching science from the perspective that no God exists or is really equally as important as approaching as if one does. I mean, either way, the absence or existence of a God is a theory no one knows, obviously. So I guess I just don't really appreciate how some scientists today can be so rudely dismissive of the idea. And of course, I mean, it goes the other way too, with hardcore fundamentalism and not at least having some skeptical belief. But the reason I bring that up is because I want to go back to something that you said a couple of minutes ago before, is that you stopped yourself in previous books from addressing who might that intelligent designer be. Were you afraid of professional repercussions?
No, not really. Intelligent design is in some ways more unpopular than talking about God. It was that I'd written 2 500-page books and it was time to stop, and there's a importance of not pressing the evidence further than it can. I didn't want to overstate my case. If we're only looking at biology, then I don't hold this view, but it is at least logically possible that the designing intelligence might be an immanent intelligence rather than a transcendent one. And I didn't have the bandwidth to address that question in the first 2 books. I'd done enough just to try to make the case for a mind of some kind. But let me speak to this. It's actually really a fascinating. I've gotten some pushback from people who are religious, who don't like the concept, like talking about God as a hypothesis. And of course, I'm not saying that God, if he exists, is merely a hypothesis in the human mind. I'm saying just the opposite, that the evidence actually supports the existence of God as a reality independent of our mind. What has returned is the idea that God, as an explanatory hypothesis, actually explains the evidence that we have at hand. So it isn't a comment on the existence, to say that the God hypothesis has returned is not saying that God is only a hypothesis. In fact, I'm arguing that the evidence points to the reality of God. But there's one of the things I appreciate about my new atheist interlocutors, Lawrence Krauss, Richard Dawkins, Sean Carroll, who's a little bit of a different kind of, he's a scientific naturalist. I think he is an atheist, but he doesn't have the same reflexive opposition or hostility towards religion. But all of these guys do a great job of framing the key issue. And there's a wonderful quote from Dawkins where he says, "The universe has exactly the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." In other words, matter in motion. And he's actually arguing that metaphysical hypotheses, the hypothesis in this case of scientific materialism, can be tested by making observations about the world around us to see if those observations match what we would expect to be the case if that metaphysical hypothesis were true. And I take that on directly and say, yeah, I agree with that underlying premise that metaphysical hypotheses are just as testable, or testable in some very rigorous ways, just as scientific hypotheses are. But then I ask the question, is it the case that the universe we observe has exactly the properties we should expect to see if at bottom there was nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, no purpose, no design? And I argue that these three different discoveries that we've been discussing are not expected on the basis of scientific naturalism or materialism. Scientific naturalism expected an eternal and self-existent universe. It was surprised and did not expect the exquisite degree of fine-tuning that we found as a necessary condition of life. And it certainly would not expect a complex digital information processing system inside every living cell. And you can even go back to the history of 19th century and 20th century evolutionary biology to see just how shocking the discoveries of the integrated and informational complexity of life were to committed scientific materialists. So I think metaphysical hypotheses are testable. The God hypothesis needn't be axiomatic. It can be evaluated rationally by looking at the evidence of the natural world. And the three big discoveries that I'm evaluating or examining rather are things that are expected on theism and were not expected given scientific naturalism. But that is where things like the multiverse hypothesis come in, because these are auxiliary hypotheses that are meant to kind of shore up the original expectations or account for the failed expectations of scientific naturalism taken at face value.
Now, I may let you plead the fifth on this the last question here, but at one point in your book, and the book is making the case for an intelligent design based on those discoveries. At one point, I believe you say that you're making the case for it, but you're not necessarily a believer yourself. I mean, to me, based on what we're talking here, you seem confident and that your personal and scientific beliefs are in line.
Oh no, I'm definitely a believer. I'm a theist and also a Christian. I'm careful to point out that not all proponents of intelligent design are theists or necessarily Christians or Orthodox Jews or classical theists of one kind or another. The people can hold to the theory of intelligent design. They can use design detection methods to infer a mind of some kind without coming to the conclusion that mind has the identity that I'm arguing constitutes the best explanation for the overall evidence. So I'm pushing the ID argument further than other ID proponents would do. This is just my own intellectual odyssey, and I think a lot of ID proponents are theists, but that's not a necessary condition of seeing evidence of design in nature. You might hold that there's evidence of design and be entirely agnostic about the source of it.
And I appreciate you taking myself and the listeners on that odyssey. I mean, really fascinating stuff. Making the case for intelligent design. This has been Dr. Stephen Meyer. We talked about his book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Appreciate your time, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And terrific probing questions that made for a very good discussion. So thank you for having me on and giving me the chance to unpack some of this stuff.
Pleasure's all mine, and let's do it again until the next one. I know nowadays we want that separation of science and religion, like separation of church and state, but I really, in regard to science and religion, I really don't think you have to separate the two. There's room for both, as we both stated, I like to think, so eloquently before. I hope that you've enjoyed these 2 back-to-back thematically connected episodes. And I guess to a degree my death anxiety has lessened a little bit. I hope that it's helped you in some form or fashion. If you were looking for something like that, definitely more open to the possibilities than ever before. Maybe that's just kind of a getting older thing, but I want you to take that same perspective and mentality, because we're going to be going down some rabbit holes over the next few episodes. Everything from archaeology to ufology, from Knights Templars to nighttime stalkers. Check out the upcoming episodes, themindseyemedia.com. On the next one specifically, in a couple weeks, we're going to be joined by J.D. Kenyon. He's going to tell us about the mythology of lost civilizations like Atlantis and recently found lost civilizations like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Join us then. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for the Mind's Eye Podcast.